Where we are so far in the Jones-Hall-Wright feud took years of small skirmishes and the siege of Fort Bates to get to this point. Several murders had taken place and several shootouts. The Hall faction was on the run and had split apart, with Talt Hall running in one direction and everyone else running for the safety of Fort Wright. We will be using newspaper articles of the time as well as some of the testimony of Clabe Jones to get a clear picture of what happened at Fort Wright and the capture of several of the Hall faction. We will also discuss how John Wright and Deputy Sheriff Dolph Draughn entered the feud and what parts they had to play. We will also see the feud come to its violent end. All aboard the Kentucky-Tennessee Living Time Machine! Please fasten your seat belts and keep your arms and legs inside of the vehicle at all times. But to get going, we need your help. We will still need to fire up the time machine to transport us. Please help us by clicking on the like, subscribe, and bell notification buttons down below. Not only does this fire up the time machine, but it convinces YouTube that we need a bigger time machine to reach more people who love history as much as you do. Now, back to our story. John Wright enters the feud. We have heard different versions on how close John Wright and Talt Hall were in their friendship. It is really unclear if Hall was working for Wright as one of his lieutenants or if he was a captain over his own faction. According to Clabe Jones, Hall was working for Wright and was protected in all that he did. According to the Hazel Green Herald from the Wolfe County, Kentucky, in their October 28, 1885 edition, there was a three-way feud going on in Letcher County. The players were the Wright family, captained by John Wright, the Jones family, headed by Deputy Sheriff Dolph Draughn, and Hall family, which was Talt Hall, as the captain. At no time did Clabe Jones mention that he was working in tandem with Dolph Draughn. We will see these two men come to loggerheads at a later time, after the capture of Fort Wright, and the feud would become a four-faction quarrel. What is clear is that Wright was willing to take up for Hall's side of the feud and ready to protect him at all costs. He makes this very clear when he sends a letter to Clabe Jones. Jones speaks about this in his autobiography. We do know that during the trial of Talt Hall that there was a fear that John Wright and his faction would break him out of the Wise County Jail. The fear was so great that Wise County Sheriff Wilson Holbrook added more guards to the jail. The news of the shootout at Fort Bates did not sit very well with John Wright. Since Talt Hall was a friend and under his protection in Letcher County, he would do all he could to protect him. So, he sent a message to Clabe Jones stating that the good citizens of Letcher County would shoot and kill Jones and his men on sight. To test out to see if this was true, Jones went to Letcher County. He found that this was not true, as all of the people there were friends to law and order and were friendly to Jones and his men. There did not seem to be any hostility in the area whatsoever toward anyone who was coming to arrest Hall and his men. John Wright versus Deputy Sheriff Dolph Draughn. If we go under the assumption that Jones and Draughn were working together to capture the Hall faction, the following excerpt from the Hazel Green Herald dated October 28, 1885 would make sense. Since Draughn would have been part of the shootout at Fort Bates and Talt Hall was wounded and several men were killed in the attempt to arrest Hall and his men. According to the same article, John Wright hated Deputy Sheriff Draughn, and at one point asked the governor of the state of Kentucky to come and cage him. Both Wright and Draughn were of considerable wealth and influence in the county, while the newspaper also says that Hall had a lot of property as well. According to the article, Hall and Wright were not acting in unison with each other. They were both working against Draughn and his faction and resisting arrest concerning the murder of Frank Sayers. The capture of Fort Wright. Clabe Jones had struck out on his own with 20 or so of his men and went to Fort Wright. After watching for a short time, several men came out of the fort carrying their guns, at which a gunfight ensued. Wright and his men fought a running fight all the way to the Cumberland Mountains. Wright had a breech-loading gun and peppered the buckshots all around Jones and his men. The only man wounded at Fort Wright was Bill Bates, who was shot in the back with a Winchester bullet that had went through a fence post first and then embedded itself just under his skin. After Wright had made his escape, his wife fixed Jones and his men breakfast when they returned to the fort. After a search of the fort, Jones went to the second-floor story of the building, where they found and arrested Miles Bates, Black Hawk Sizemore, and Bill D. Hall, who was the brother of Talt Hall. Jones then took the prisoners towards Prestonsburg, Kentucky. Draughn's failed attempt to arrest John Wright. The newspaper article goes on to say that all of the men in this trouble were related to each other and they hated each other. It also states that Deputy Sheriff Draughn gathered together a posse of about 30 men to arrest Wright. They were ambushed on the way to carry out their duties, and a general fight ensued, in which several men were wounded. We can assume that the reason why Draughn wanted to arrest Wright was for the action of aiding and abetting Hall and his faction, which was illegal. The ambush in question could have been when Draughn attempted to capture Fort Wright during one of his many raids that took place. According to Clabe Jones, Deputy Draughn had made a posse of men of his own and had made a raid on Fort Wright. This was not successful, and upon their return trip, Draughn and his men were waylaid and ambushed by Wright and his men, and a gunfight ensued. One of Draughn's men had been killed, and the horse that Draughn had been riding had been shot out from underneath him. Claib Jones versus Deputy Sheriff Draughn. According to Jones, on the way to Prestonsburg, they stopped for the night in Hyman, Kentucky. There they had met up with Deputy Draughn, who relayed the story of his failed attempt to arrest Wright. Draughn wanted revenge for this and was determined to kill Bates, Sizemore, and Hall. Jones told him that if he wanted to kill men, then he needed to capture his own. Draughn gave the orders for his men to line up to shoot the prisoners. Jones and his men got in front of the prisoners and drew their guns. Draughn saw that it was going to be a fight and withdrew his men and left. Thus, on this trip, Fort Wright was broken up, and John Wright and his men fled to Virginia. Jones made it to Prestonsburg the next day, and the prisoners were placed in the Floyd County Jail. The jailer, Jim Lane, was afraid that Wright would come and do a jailbreak, releasing the prisoners. Jones went to court and got permission to have an extra man guard the prisoners. Cicero Cox was chosen by Jones as a guard. There was a large reward offered for Talt Hall, George Johnson, and others, but there was no reward for John Wright. The fate of the Hall faction. According to the Daily Evening Bulletin dated December 21, 1885, William J. Bates, Miles Bates, and George Johnson, 3 alleged murderers from Floyd County, were captured and brought to jail. They were charged with the killing of Mac Hall and Ab Little in Floyd County sometime last June. A reward of $150 was offered for their capture. A scheme was fixed up between the two Bates and Johnson and some of their friends to secure this reward. The accused were to surrender themselves to the authorities, and then as soon as the reward had been paid, they were all to be released again. Some of Ab Little's friends, however, dropped into the scheme and determined to take the prisoners out and hang them. In order to prevent this, they were brought to Catlettsburg last Friday and lodged in the jail at that place. After some time, John Wright brought in all of the other men from the Hall gang except for Talt Hall, Wash Craft, and George Johnson. John Wright got the reward for all of the men he turned in. Wash Craft had left the area. They must have been released at a later date, because in 1891, Miles Bates would make his way to Norton, Virginia, and be the cause behind the murder of Ennis Hilton. George Johnson would be found dead in the woods, shot by what he thought to be one of his friends. The fate of Bill D. Hall and William J. Bates is kind of uncertain. According to the William Billy D. Hall Find a Grave website, he died in Knott County, Kentucky on March 1st, 1909, at the age of 86. According to the Genii website, William J. Bates died on March 8, 1919, at the age of 79 in Knott County, Kentucky. End of the feud. According to the New York Times, for the right side of the feud, it was quelled on September 19, 1885, when the fight escalated and Deputy Sheriff Dolph Draughn, Sam Cook, and William Francis were killed. However, for Talt Hall, the fight was not over and would continue between his side and Jones for many years. As for Wright and Hall, they would become best of friends after this point in their history. Talt Hall would face the gallows in Wise County, Virginia on September 2, 1892, for the murder of police officer Enos Hilton. John Wesley Wright would die at the age of 86 in Pound, Virginia on January 30, 1931. Clabe Jones would die in Warren, Kentucky on November 25, 1914, at the age of 88 years old. Thank you. We at Kentucky Tennessee Living would like to thank you for watching our video series on the Appalachian feuds. Don't forget to hit that like button, as the more likes we receive, the more likely YouTube is to suggest our videos to other viewers. Also, to receive notice when we upload a new video, be sure to subscribe and click that bell for notifications. We thank you for continuing to support Kentucky Tennessee Living as we are discovering the mysteries of Appalachian history.